Historical Minnesota story time. When you think of the notorious gangsters of the 20s and 30s, think of places like Chicago and New York. Minnesota probably doesn't come to mind. The story of Prohibition-era mobsters and gangsters is incomplete without St. Paul. Despite the National Prohibition Act being introduced by one of our own dumbass congressmen, Andrew Volstead, Minnesotans love to drink, and we've never let pesky things like laws get in the way of that. During Prohibition, St. Paul subsequently became one of the wettest cities in a dry country. But where the liquor flowed, the gangsters followed. Police Chief John O'Connor realized that the tactics of fighting these criminals in the streets, like they were doing in Chicago and out east, it wasn't being very effective. He decided to go a different route and came up with the Layover Agreement, an unofficial contract between the city of St. Paul and criminals. It basically said, don't start trouble, won't be trouble. Don't fuck around in St. Paul, don't commit crimes, don't cause a ruckus, and St. Paul police won't bother you. Subsequently, basically every famous gangster you can think of from that era spent a substantial amount of time in St. Paul. John Dillinger, Al Capone, Bonnie and Clyde, you name them, they were probably hanging out in St. Paul at some point. Many ended up using Minnesota as a home base. Al Capone even had a little hideaway up in Finland, Minnesota. And the agreement worked. Despite being flush with illegal alcohol and the most notorious criminals in the world, St. Paul had very little gang-related violent crime. Unfortunately, this agreement only applied to St. Paul. And as a result, 20% of bank robberies that happened during that era happened in Minnesota. Many of them just across the river in Minneapolis. But nonetheless, it makes for some really cool forgotten history. If you're ever in the area, you can visit some of the places that these notorious criminals hung out. And one of my absolute favorites is the Wabasha Street Caves, which are abandoned mines on Wabasha Street along the Mississippi River. And in the 1920s, it was a nightclub and a speakeasy for all the famous gangsters. And it's really cool because they still operate it today. All underground, and you can go there and do tours multiple days of the week. On Thursday nights, they have a big band and swing dancing, so you can actually go there and feel what it was like when Al Capone was sitting there. If you're in Minnesota and you haven't checked it out, I highly, highly recommend it. Do the tour and go for the dancing. It is just a very cool experience and some awesome local history. And just another reason why Minnesota is one of the coolest places in the world.